Hiya. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Welcome. We'll just give everybody else a few more minutes. We'll see if anyone else shows up. Hopefully they will. I think we've got about 4 people signed up, but it is the summer holidays, so you can say. Are you doing any other classes?
Um, Not recently, but I normally have a big focus on English
Okay. Righto. Yeah.
class.
Nice. Super. We'll see. Well, we'll see. We're going to do some bit of history and then we'll see how we get on when no one else comes. Give them a couple of minutes. Just to let you know, we're recording the lesson so that um Jenny and Helen can like send it out if they need to. Um, oh, there's media. Good. Hi, Amelia. I'm just waiting to see if anyone else shows up. We'll give them a couple more minutes and then we can get started. Oh, Amy, maybe. Two Amy's. All right. We will well, I'll just give them one more minute just because I'm expecting two more people, but we'll see. Jenny was a bit unsure whether everybody would show up, but we'll see. All right, let's have a look. All right, guys. Hello, welcome. It's really nice to see you, even though there's just two. That's a good start to a GCSE history class. Don't need too many people, really. Um, my name is Mrs. Tomlinson, or Marianne, whichever you're most comfortable with. I don't mind at all. I used to teach in normal secondary schools for many, many years, about 15 years in the classroom. And I gave up teaching when I had my first baby. And Now I've got two little ones at home and one on the way very soon, but hopefully that won't be too disruptive. I've got lots of backup at home, so we should be able to get through the content. We're going to have a look at the IGCSE history, which you probably know is the sort of international GCSE. And I've been working with the Cambridge exam board because you can do a no coursework option. Coursework's a little bit tricky when you're not in a school setting, as far as I know. Anyway, so there is in you'd have about 30 hours teaching, I think, 32 hours teaching. So be quite a lot to get through each week. Which is just worth bearing in mind and having a look at when you before you sign up. I mean, obviously, it's not compulsory to take the exam or anything. I mean, that's not. I realise that's not always the point of things, but if you are, there's quite a lot to get through. But it's a fascinating course. It's really, really, really interesting, and well, a nice time, I think. So, just open the window. My curtain's blowing in front of my camera. So I have to shut it again. Hopefully, so look. So, some of you might remember this Prime Minister, hated by many, loved by a few, I think. But he had an interesting thing to say about history, and he's not the first person ever to ever said this. There are lots of sort of more kind of more famous historians who've said very similar things. Uh, but it's important to consider why we study history, I think. And it's not just because it's interesting, although it is. But Tony Blair said, I think it's vitally important to study history. If we are going to lead Britain safely into the future, it is essential that we understand our country's historical roots. If we can learn the lessons of the past, we will be able to avoid making mistakes in the future. So the question is, to what extent was he correct? Does anybody have a view? Do you think he's right about that? You're right that we need to be able to avoid making mistakes in the future. It's hard to sort of it's an interesting question. It's one of the kind of key things that you'll be asked that we sort of study, I suppose, in history is the key question, to what extent? Because very, very rarely you ask just a sort of simple yes or no question in history. Very often you're asked to consider slightly more subtle questions than that, such as to what extent, how far. And obviously you can say, I think to a certain extent he must be right, because um, not just the country we're currently in or you're currently in. I don't know where everybody is actually, but um, you know, studying the history of the country you're in is important because perhaps you notice patterns, and perhaps you can avoid the sort of the mistakes of the past, the failures of the past, particularly if you're in government. But obviously, that doesn't always isn't it's not foolproof, because history does repeat itself. You see that sort of time and time again in when you study history. You have repeated genocides, you have repeated wars, you have armed conflicts go on for very, very many, many years. So simply studying history isn't enough. So if I was answering that question as a sort of historian, I might say, well, to a certain extent, that must be true. We can't possibly hope to avoid the mistakes of the past unless we study it, unless we keep it in view. But it isn't a sort of foolproof method, because as we've seen, these things do repeat. And also the historical context changes, at least somewhat, that the different parties of government, the conflict sort of shift, and the dynamics shift and the rhetoric shift. So it's not a sort of foolproof trick, but it is very important to study history, I think. So I talked a little bit about history questions already. One of the things I mean, I don't mind if you don't want to contribute today and sort of chat away today. But one of the things I think we really will have to do in a sort of in history classes is to talk, discussion is very important because it's in the sort of oral kind of contribution, it's in the discussion that you can really sort of like hone your arguments. And I am assuming at this point that people want to work towards the sort of GCSE qualification. If it turns out that the class doesn't want to work to the GCSE qualification, we can sort of shift the emphasis slightly. But on the assumption that people do want to work towards the GCSE qualification, we'll think about some key questions. Okay, so think about things like how far do you agree? To what extent is something true? To what extent do you agree? Do you think to what extent is something proved? And how important was a particular event? And the absolute key thing when you're preparing for a sort of GCSE of this sort of nature um, is that you have to be prepared to make a judgment and defend an argument. That's really important. So you have to be able to examine information and make a judgment and defend an argument. That can be quite tricky. It takes a bit of practice if you're not used to it. That's all. It's just a sort of it's just practicing. And one of the things you have to be sort of prepared to do is to be wrong and to be sort of uncomfortable and to try out sort of try on different things. All right. So those are some kind of key history questions. One of the best things I think about history is looking at sources. Does anyone have an idea about what a source is? When we talk about sources, what is a source? So I think we can think of a source as just somewhere where we get information. So people do look at who's chatting, who's making a message. That's right. Yeah, a newspaper is a good example. I was just going to suggest that actually that every day we look at newspapers, don't we? Or well, maybe not every day, but we regularly look at newspapers, whether it be online or in sort of paper form. And that exactly is a good example of a source. Yeah, well done. And the thing with newspaper is a really good example actually, because you can, when you look at a source in a newspaper, say sort of headline story in the Times or the Telegraph or even the Daily Mail, you naturally start to criticize it. You think, well, they're trying to communicate this, they're trying to communicate that. This is their bias. This is their this is what they're trying to evoke in the population who reads it. We all know, don't we, that a newspaper story is not just cold hard facts. It's not the truth. And if you wanted to find, get close to the truth of the matter, you have to examine a range of sources. You might have to examine a range of, a range of sources, a range of newspapers to sort of determine what is really true. That's a good one. Well done. So when considering sources, there are like a range of questions to consider. So what's the message of the source? What is the point of it? Why? What is the author of the source trying to communicate? Or evoke even, what's it trying to sort of, what feelings it trying to evoke in you? Sometimes perhaps you're better at screen time than me, but sometimes if you're sort of like on the computer trying to do something and then your news feed sends you an article that it thinks you'll be interested in, and then you realize it's just a sort of what they call a clickbait story, and it's trying to get you to engage with the newspaper, and it's just a sort of feelings-based headline. Another question is, how does one source support or corroborate another source? And if you can find two sources which sort of suggest the same thing, suggest the same set of facts, that adds credibility to the first one, doesn't it? We all do that sort of automatically. Why was a source produced? Talked about that a little bit already. And then the sort of bigger question, the wider question, is how far do all the sources prove an argument? So remember I said right at the beginning that you might have you might have a sort of key question and you need to make a judgment and make an argument. So if you're looking at that in terms of sources, you you might be asking, whether how far do all the sources prove an argument? Okay. So oops, just briefly then, before we look at some sources, types of source questions could be about interpreting, the interpretation of a source, the purpose, what's the point of it, the comparison, how does one source compare with another, which one is more reliable, which one is more convincing. Evaluation is just, which is a better source, basically. And then testing a hypothesis, which is just about kind of testing that argument you're trying to make. And obviously you can have textual and visual sources. And in the IGCSE, you won't look at very many video sources, although they do exist, to be fair. We probably will look at the odd thing. If anyone speaks German, you can, look at videos of Hitler speaking, for example. I don't speak German, so we probably won't do that, but you could. All right, so this is quite interesting. Sorry, the picture's a little bit blurred, but hopefully you can just about see it. This is a source from the current IGCSE. And the source is the England football team giving Hitler the salute before a match in Berlin in 1938. So I'll start you off just because it makes life easier. But 1938 was a year before the Second World War broke out. But Hitler had been in power for 5 years. My math is correct. And so Hitler was in Germany. He passed the Enabling Act, so essentially he was running a dictatorship. Um, so can anyone think? You can type in the chat box. That's really good thing to think of. If you don't want to speak out loud, that's absolutely fine. But is anything surprising about this source, do you think? And what could be the context of this source? Like why would this happen? And is there anything surprising about the source, do you suppose? I'll give you a sec. I'd like to see some answers if you can. Don't worry about being wrong. You haven't done this before, so I won't think less of you. All right. I'll share some thoughts and maybe you will join in. I mean, I think this source is a bit surprising, particularly, at first glance, because just about a year later, those football players those English football players and those German football players would have been shooting at each other. I've no idea at the moment about I'd have to find out about who survived and who died in the Second World War. That would have been a good question, actually. I should have found that before. But who survived that and who didn't? And so just goes to show, I suppose, how quickly things can change on the sort of international scene. At this point in time, England thought that there was going to be perhaps peace with Germany, that they'd be able to stop Germany doing what was sort of promised. The war could be avoided. I think probably some people had an inkling that war was likely to go ahead, but at this point it was peacetime. At this point, Germany and England were not enemies. So why were the England team giving the Hitler salute? Because they were playing in Germany, and they were going with the flow, and they were sort of they'd come in peace, despite the abhorrent nature of what went on in Germany after. so the sort of context is really important that like, you look at it and you think, how could those men do that? But then you consider the context and think, well, they weren't at war. As far as they know, they were not enemies. Um, and it adds a sort of, a kind of tragic layer, really, doesn't it? When you think that those men, those young men, would have been at war very soon afterwards. Okay. This one I loved as well. This is also um this is a quote from Winston Churchill a bit later. So this is not Nazi Germany. This is 1946, so after the war, just after the war. And the context is to do with um the sort of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the Iron Curtain, the takeover um of the USSR in the Soviet region. Um, and Hitler said, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line, like all the capitals, move you out of the way, move all the move all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but very high in many cases. Oops, excuse me. Increasing the measure of control from Moscow. And this is one of the interesting things about history is that often, who's a goodie and who's a baddie, is not clear all the time. Because obviously the what went on in oh sorry, I'm just seeing the thing about fixing your microphone. Don't worry. What went on in Russia on the other side of the Iron Curtain is very is is not something that most sort of British people kind of accepted as good. But they were on our side in the Second World War. So here, Winston Churchill is making a speech in America, and basically what he's trying to do is get people to take notice to what's going on behind the Iron Curtain, to take notice of the USSR, take notice of the Soviet sphere, as he calls it, as the communist bloc. So here he's deliberately trying to evoke a response. He's deliberately trying to evoke a response. And so that's why context becomes so important in history. All right, it's not just it isn't just like um it isn't just the sort of facts as you see them. You've got to consider the context and what the source is trying to communicate. And that's two aspects of the IGCSE is Nazi Germany and the sort of Soviet era. So I mean, it's really kind of the whole kind of course really uh forms the basis of what uh, of sort of modern Europe, I suppose. Um, what of this one? What does this source tell you about Nazi Germany, do you think? Any ideas? You can put in the chat box if you've got an idea, or I can blather at you. All right. Well, one of the things that you might know, it's quite a sort of fairly kind of commonly sort of disseminated idea, is that in Nazi Germany, they were trying to sort of create well, super race is a little bit sort of little bit colloquial, but really trying to emphasize health and well-being, kind of a particular look of sort of sort of physical strength, basically. And sort of quite ironically, there were sort of pro-family, policies. Like, it was good to have lots of children. It was good for the mum to be at home looking after these lots of healthy children. People were promised kind of space um, and a good education for these children. And the men were going to be strong warrior fighter types who kind of sustained their family. Um, and so in Nazi Germany, you saw lots and lots of propaganda like this. That, there were these kind of healthy kind of healthy families, lots of children, often blonde. Um, and to establish that, uh, they sort of drew on the eugenics program, which didn't originate with Nazi Germany. That's quite important to emphasize, really, as a sort of perhaps made famous by Mengele and the other sort of Nazi German doctors. But it really did emerge in right across the sort of early 20th century Europe, the idea that you could manipulate a population by kind of controlling who had children and what genes kind of went forward into the future. So it's very important to realize that eugenics, as an idea at least, as a sort of concept, was very widespread. And so, but within Nazi Germany, that was sort of taken up, and people tried to, Hitler and the Nazi Party tried to sort of make sure that uh, it was sort of purebred, healthy German couples who had lots of children, and they took this sort of extreme step of trying to eliminate people who might kind of contaminate the gene pool, obviously with a particular emphasis on people of sort of Jewish origin, but plenty of others too, gypsies, the disabled, Catholics, people of other sort of sects. So it became a sort of a very kind of the background to these kind of sources is very dark, really. Uh, But what they were trying to communicate is, look, that Nazi Germany is like this. You're going to have health, you're going to have well-being, you're going to have children, you're going to have space, you're going to have great education for your children, that kind of thing. Okay. What about this one? Why would this picture be published, do you think? You see lots of these kinds of propaganda pictures um, in the newspapers, etc. Lots and lots of these kind of propaganda pictures. Um, and Hitler was an interesting character. He had quite a sort of troubled kind of early adulthood, going from thing to thing, going from art, going to art school and floated around a bit before he landed up in politics. And his early political career was not particularly sort of illuminating. He went to prison. He wrote Mein Kampf in prison, and but by all accounts, he was sort of charismatic leader, and people found him extraordinary to listen to. And they came from the context, didn't they, of the First World War, where they'd been so impoverished really by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. So, oh, discuss. But that's one argument that lots of Germans are very disgruntled by that. Um, and but Hitler, this picture is from an early rally in Nazi Germany just after he'd sort of taken over Germany, just after he'd sort of become a dictator of Germany, really. Because in the early days, he won the election. He didn't he was voted in, but when he passed the Enabling Act preventing sort of elections, he became a dictator. But you can see there are many, many, perhaps thousands of people gathered to watch him. He's got a sort of an army, literally, of soldiers flanking his left and his right, with the famous sort of Nazi flag held high. And this source really, I think, although discuss always, you can always discuss, you can always argue, it's about power. Um, it's about demonstrating the power of Hitler and his Nazi party. And that was key. That was absolutely critical um, in sort of solidifying solidifying the whole arrangement, making the whole arrangement as it is, as it was. All right. So one thing I find quite useful at the beginning or end of lessons to kind of consolidate information, are sort of short videos. We won't do more than about 10 minutes because you're on screen, you're learning on screen anyway. But sometimes these are quite useful. If we go on to have a sort of regular history class, be useful to sort of get feedback about how useful they are and whether it's worth the lesson time. I mean, if we get to sort of be able to kind of chat more, it maybe won't be. But let's have a look because this is quite a good sort of summary about what happened, the sort of context of the emergence of the Nazis and what happened. So let's see if it works. Hopefully it will.
1918 and the First World War is finally over. As punishment for losing, Germany's two wartime allies, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, were carved up shortly afterwards. The pressures of defeat plunged Germany into chaos, and as a result, the Kaiser abdicated. Revolution and counter-revolution were the order of the day, and in the small town of Weimar, Berlin was too dangerous, the Weimar Republic was declared. The next year, the Allies signed the Treaty of Versailles, which dictated the terms of Allied victory. This territory was lost, and the Rhineland was occupied by the Allies. Germany further had to reduce its military massively, pay war reparations, and also had to accept almost full responsibility for the war's outbreak. So this new Weimar Republic is one of the most democratic nations in the world at that point. Suffrage was granted to everyone over the age of 20, including women. The German people could vote on two aspects of the national government. Every 7 years they voted on a president who presided over the German parliament, the Reichstag. Every 4 years people would vote for political parties in national elections for the Reichstag via a system known as proportional representation, whereby the percentage of votes nationally dictated the percentage of seats in the Reichstag. The president could call elections whenever he felt and also had the important job of appointing the chancellor who ran the government and could propose laws. These laws had to be passed by a majority vote in the Reichstag, and since no party ever got 50% of the seats, that meant that parties would have to cooperate. No, democracy did not guarantee harmony, and there was numerous attempts at revolution, such as the quickly aborted Socialist Republic of Bavaria and the 1920 revolution led by Dr. Wolfgang Kapp. Kapp seized Berlin, and the German army refused to attack him because there was a strong belief that Germany had only lost the war due to political betrayal. Kapp's revolution was only ended by a general strike which ground the country to a halt. This turmoil did not help the German economy, and eventually Germany missed a war payment. The French wished to punish the Germans for this, whereas the British wanted leniency. The French government decided that if the Germans would not pay them, then they'd simply take the money instead, and in 1923 the French occupied the heavily industrialized region of the Ruhr. The reason for this was that German reparations could be paid in raw materials, many of which were produced there. Another way that German reparations could be paid was in foreign currencies, which were paid for by printing more paper marks. This created the hyperinflation that the Weimar Republic is famous for. For example, in January 1923, a loaf of bread cost 163 marks, and in early November in 1923, the same loaf of bread cost over 75 billion marks. In November 1923, another attempted revolution occurred in Munich, led by a certain Adolf Hitler and undertaken by the SA, the military arm of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. This revolution failed when other nationalist politicians refused to help Hitler and the army was called in. Hitler was wounded and arrested shortly afterwards. It was in prison that Hitler dictated his autobiography, Mein Kampf, which became the bedrock of Nazi ideology. All of this would make it seem like the Weimar Republic was about to immediately collapse, but it managed to survive thanks to the intervention of two specific individuals. Gustav Stresemann, who helped to repair relations with France, and Charles Dawes, an American who would later become vice president, who helped to relieve some of Germany's economic problems. Germany's repayments were lowered, the French agreed to leave the Ruhr, and America agreed to loan Germany money, which created a strong economic link between the two countries. So then the Great Depression struck, tanking the US economy and dragging Germany's down with it. Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany at the time, failed to get the Reichstag to agree on a response, or anything. As a result, he had to invoke Article 48, which allowed the president to pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag in times of emergency. The biggest problem with Article 48 was that there was no definition of an emergency, meaning it was open to abuse. The German people turned to different political parties to fix the problems. Some chose communism, whereas others placed their faith in the National Socialists. The Nazis believed that the German-speaking peoples should be united in a single state. They argued that communists and the Jews were the enemies of the German people and as such had to be removed. The Nazis were popular because they wished to disregard the Treaty of Versailles, which many Germans considered insulting. They also wished to limit any foreign involvement in German affairs by limiting the rights and numbers of foreigners in Germany. Another reason was people's anger with the continuing economic crises which they were desperate to end. A series of elections led to a massive increase in the number of seats held by the Nazis, and by 1932 they were the largest party by far. After continuously coming first, Hitler asked President Hindenburg to be made Chancellor, which he refused several times because they were worried that Hitler would overthrow the government. Yet eventually, after the Nazis' continuous victories in elections, Hindenburg agreed to give him the job in January 1933. So Hitler immediately began working to overthrow the government. A fire started in the Reichstag by a young Dutch communist was used by Hitler to paint all communists as the enemies of Germany. Hindenburg, under pressure from Hitler, issued the Reichstag Fire Decree, and the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which suspended many civil liberties and made Hitler the de facto dictator of Germany. These were passed mainly because the opposing communist parties were outlawed and that the vote was being held in a building filled with armed members of the SA. Over the next few months, Hitler established the secret police, the Gestapo, in order to help shore up his position. He outlawed trade unions as they were seen as breeding grounds for communists, and in July he abolished all other political parties. In 1934, Hitler ordered the SS, another paramilitary group, and the Gestapo to eliminate his enemies, which included the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, in an event known as the Night of the Long Knives. This was mainly because Hitler felt that the SA was the only force that could stop him. Shortly after this purge, President Hindenburg died, and Hitler assumed the role of president as well as that of the Chancellor. He declared himself the Führer of Germany and, using Article 48, create a single-party dictatorship. The lives of Germans changed massively under the new Nazi regime. The media was brought under the control of Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Propaganda. Heinrich Himmler was placed in command of the Gestapo and the SS, who were ordered to crack down on anyone who disagreed with the Nazi government. Germans, for the most part, accepted having less freedoms in return for a higher standard of living, and because the Nazis had ended the chaos from the decade before they took power. The Nazi government established the German Labour Front, which was like a trade union except without the representation. The Nazis also established the Strength Through Joy program, which was designed to keep workers happy. It even helped to reduce class barriers by making vacations, clubs, cinemas, and other recreational activities open to people outside of the upper classes. Its most popular creation was the People's Car, better known as the Volkswagen, which further bridged the class divide since it could be paid for in installments. In 1936, Hermann Göring was put in charge of the economy, beginning the 4-year plan, which was supposed to make Germany entirely self-sufficient within 4 years. Unemployment virtually disappeared, conscription was instated, and major public works were undertaken, most famously the Autobahn and the Berlin Olympic Games. The most important part of the 4-year plan was that it saw the beginning of German rearmament, which was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's plan to unify the German people picked up towards the end of the 30s. In 1938, after some double dealing, threats, and a referendum, German troops marched into Austria and Hitler announced its annexation. After negotiations with the British and the French, it was agreed that Germany would annex the ethnically German Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Germany soon afterwards occupied half of it, which wasn't agreed. The Lithuanians then caved into Hitler's demands for this territory. The British and the French, afraid of a new major war in Europe, did nothing to deter Hitler from seizing more and more territory or rearming, which served only to embolden him. An agreement was then made between Germany and the Soviet Union to divide Poland, and on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded, and 2 weeks later the Soviets would do the same, beginning the Second World War. Britain had an agreement with Poland and declared war on Germany, although Germany would quickly overrun France. In 1941, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union shortly before declaring war on the United States. Two very bad ideas. The Germans were initially very successful, and by 1943 the Third Reich looked like this. The Allies, particularly the British and the United States, began bombing campaigns against German cities, most notably Cologne, Hamburg, and of course, Dresden. These attacks were designed to destroy German factories and infrastructure, as well as frighten the Germans into submission. The German economy did change drastically at the beginning of the war, since Germany had already been producing arms for many years. One major difference between Germany and the Allies was that Germany was very reluctant to have women working in the factories, which ultimately lowered the number of available workers and frontline soldiers. In the conquered territories, the Nazis implemented a policy of forced labour. In Poland, many women were forced to work farmlands to produce food, whilst men worked in factories. Many Jewish people, alongside anyone else considered undesirable, were used for slave labour to produce weapons, some of which they sabotaged. Throughout Europe, the Jewish populations were rounded up and placed into concentration camps. The original purpose of these camps was not extermination but forced labour, although they all had horrendous mortality rates. Before and throughout the war, the Nazis had attempted to decide on what they would do with the Jewish population of Europe. At first, the Nazis wished to deport them, and in fact some were sent to Palestine. It wasn't until 1942 that the camps began to explicitly exterminate prisoners, or that specialised extermination camps were opened. The best-known camps being Auschwitz and Treblinka, where over 1.5 million people were killed between them. Throughout the Holocaust, it is believed that roughly 5.5 million Jews were killed alongside roughly the same amount of Poles and Soviet prisoners. Gypsies, those with mental and physical disabilities, as well as homosexuals, were also exterminated alongside them. Having failed to conquer the Soviet Union, the tide of the war changed against the Nazis, and the Soviets managed to force them all the way back into Germany, liberating many of the concentration camps on the way. At the same time, the United States, United Kingdom and Canada, amongst others, invaded Western Europe, and together they managed to push the Nazis back into Germany as well. Most of the German high command, including Hitler, committed suicide in April 1945, and Germany surrendered in May, thus ending the Third Reich and the Nazi regime. Germany was occupied, and the surviving Nazi leaders were put on trial at Nuremberg, where many were sentenced to death. After its surrender, Germany and Berlin were split into occupied zones, and both began the process of denazification. The Allied occupation zones were soon combined into the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Soviet occupied zones became the German Democratic Republic, known as West and East Germany respectively. They would remain divided until 1990 at the end of the Cold War. Ultimately, the legacy of Nazi Germany is complex. The Nazis, whilst committing unimaginable crimes, managed to reinvigorate Germany and build it into a military powerhouse. The Nazis brought about immense suffering across the European continent, and their actions reduced many countries, including Germany itself, to ruins. The consequences of Nazism are still being examined because, frankly, it's still too soon to know exactly what they are. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching.
Right, so you just a whistle-stop tour through the course. Appreciate you can't like learn loads and loads for a sort of very quick 10-minute video, but hopefully you can sort of see the sort of a general sort of trajectory of the sort of emergence of Nazi Germany. Any questions either about me or the course or history or anything you want me to know about you before we go?
Is it a 1 or 2 year course?
We can do it in 1 year. That's the sort of general aim for the GCSEs, yeah.
Right.
Is that what you're expecting?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do it in 1. I mean, there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot to get through, but it is doable. Yeah.
Like for the exam, is it more like learning facts or like writing about things? Like, is it more writing based or like
More
facts?
writing based, yeah. I mean, you get about sort of 2/3 of your marks really from making arguments and sort of analysing and evaluating rather than learning facts. And you need the facts to do the argument, but it's quite the exam asks for sort of fairly kind of high level skills, and that there are essays to write. So there'll be 4 exam papers, all of which are sort of essay based questions or like longer answer written questions, I suppose.
Is it just the Second World War?
No, so we look at the Germany, the Soviet Union, and also like as a sort of separate paper, America, in that time as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Using the chat box. You're welcome, Amy. Yeah. Thank you for coming. All right, guys. So, email Domox if you've got any questions or like any sort of follow-up comments. If we go ahead and have a sort of history class, not quite sure how many like what our numbers need to be, we can like totally discuss like how the sort of learning strategies and learning styles that work for you, because obviously I'm sort of going in kind of cold here. But you know, feedback and etc. is really really useful. Like, you know, I want to make it work for you guys. So don't worry about that. All right. But love to meet you both, and hope you have a good rest of August. Perhaps see you in September. We'll see how we get on. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye bye. Stop recording.